And speaking of it not ending soon, taking a while, you described it as a war of attrition. So how did that go? Like the process of the strike as a whole before it started to cool down.
Well, it settled into a routine after a little while where we would come to work, we would get yelled at, we would do our jobs, put out the paper, and that act of putting out the paper was the thing that was really hard for unions. They were having a strike to prevent the operation of the newspaper, and we were not stopping. We kept making newspapers. We made them every day. I don't know if that first day's paper got anywhere, but we never missed a day of publication, and this was hard for the unions to take from the standpoint that they weren't really shutting us down. And I think other people said, well, what kind of strike is that if they're still in business?
Yeah.
So they started doubling up on efforts to have people boycott the paper.
So it was
and they started their own paper.
Kind of a weakening position for them, just because it wasn't that effectual. Or?
Well, I think almost every newspaper that is struck plans to keep publishing. I mean, if you don't publish, you're going to lose everything. All your advertisers are going to, of course, they're going to want their money back. Your advertisers are going to find, or your readers are going to find other things to read, and you're going to pretty quickly lose your revenue base. So every newspaper that I know of has tried to publish. During the strike, we were publishing that joint edition.
How common do you think strikes are in the newspaper business, at least at the time?
At the time, you might get about one big strike a year and a couple of small ones. There had been a strike in Seattle the year before, and I had friends who worked in that, and we, commiserated.
So, I'm curious though, how was the strike covered in the Free Press, the news, and even the greater Detroit media like Channel 7 and 4?
Well, I would say that, the Detroit dailies seem to try to do an even-handed job. It's hard to do that because everybody who's writing about it is affected by it, and they're writing, and their stories are going to be closely read by their supervisors. And you have people in the union, one important side of the story, that doesn't want to talk to you. So you're going to be getting a one-sided story anyway. And then it's going to be closely watched to make sure that you don't go out of bounds, get something wrong on the other side. The companies, of course, didn't tell the reporters very much, like what the plan is or how much are we spending a day to publish the paper. I think the TV stations, because they were not involved in the strike, came closest to being objective. The local weekly, or the Metro Times, as I recall, was pretty much anti-company. That fits with an alternative news weekly. And so a lot of its coverage was critical of the companies. And of course the unions would talk to them if they did it that way, so they were getting the other side of the story. So probably the best way to get a story might be to read 2 or 3 different things, as is the case always.
Yeah. So when the union actually finally started to wind down and they started, how did that go about? How did it finally?
Well, it was a long process. One key event in all of this was when the company sent a letter, this is the Free Press now, sent a letter to all of its striking employees saying, please come back to work by this Friday or whatever. Because after that we're going to start hiring replacement workers because we have to get the paper out. We can't do this with expensive people we fly in from other cities and put up in hotels. The letter was written and signed by about 6 top executives at the Free Press, including Neil Shine, Heath Merriweather, probably Chip Vichy, Carol E. Hutton. It was signed by the top people at the paper. And part of the rationale for the letter was that some people who were on strike had told us that, because there was always talk going back and forth, there were some people working who were married to people who were on strike. And we could talk every day on the picket line, and there was lots of informal channels of communication. But it became pretty clear that some people needed a letter to come back to work. They were ready to come back to work, but they didn't want to come back to work and be sort of criticized by their union brothers and sisters if they didn't have a really, really good reason for crossing the picket line. And for some of them, the threat that they would be replaced was a good enough reason. So the letter was written. People started coming back in greater numbers when they got that letter. Some were scared, some were relieved to have that incentive, and others were outraged and said that the company planned to give their jobs away, which was wrong in a couple of ways. One way was that they don't own those jobs. Nobody owns their job. And the other way was that you can't fire a person for striking. Now, what wound up happening was when people said, I want to come back to work, if there was no vacancy for them, they had to wait until there was a vacancy, and then they were called back from a callback list. So we stopped hiring anybody except striking or formerly striking union members at a certain point. The union members were hoping that there would be a ruling by the National Labor Relations Board that this had been an unfair labor practice strike. That means that the workers went on strike because the company had been unfair, and that ruling never came, but their hope was that they would get that ruling, and that would require the companies to pay the workers for all the time they were off the job. But that never really happened.
And according to you, is John Castine, the union president, was the first called back?
Yeah, he was the first called back among reporters. John Castine had been writing news, I believe, and he was president of the unit at the Free Press. And because he also had the most seniority, just a coincidence, he was the first person we called back to work. And he came back to work briefly, and then he quit. His wife was also a union member, and I think her name was Peggy. And John, I think, then went off to run a hockey magazine, which was closer to what his real passion is.
Was he a sports writer? Or?
No, he'd wanted to be a sports writer, and he had done some sports, but mostly we had him working on the Metro desk.
I see. Let's see here. About from start to finish, it was. You said the court settlement was 1998. I wonder, what year did the strike start?
Well, the strike started really in 95.
So it was about 3 years?
Well, the strike went for about 21 months, and then you had all kinds of continuing legal stuff after that. And then there was a settlement that sort of cleaned up the last complaints. Some people had been fired by the company for doing stuff. You could get fired for vandalism. You know, you could get fired for, I think some people got fired for what others considered to be legitimate strike activity, you know, picketing, stuff like that. And so that stuff all had to be worked out and negotiated by attorneys for both sides.
Okay. Is there anything you think I didn't get to that I should have in this video? Just like as a brief overview of the strike?
You got it pretty good. I mean, one of the things to look at is, did the strike work, and how did it affect the Detroit papers?
Yes.
And does the strike play much of a role in where the papers are today?
Do you think as a whole, did this whole affair with the strike weaken the position of the unions? In terms of
Yeah, it did. One of the things that the unions agreed to was an open shop. Which means people are not automatically in the union when they join the Free Press. They have to decide.
Was that direct result of this, or was that the case before?
That was a direct result of this. Before it had been a closed shop. If you were a reporter, you were in the union.
Okay.
No choice. You had to be in the union to work there. And then they got to a place where you don't have to join the union. Of course, now most people in jobs represented by the union are also members of the union. So the company lost that advantage over time because actually the company didn't work as hard as the union did. The union can work hard to get people to join. They can have parties and mixers and pressure you and all that kind of stuff. The company can't really pressure you to not join a union. That's not really legal.
Of course.
So it's kind of a, one hand behind your back kind of thing.
It's kind of like a temporary reprieve of sorts.
Yeah, and who knows if it adds much to what does the company gain by having a non-union workforce?
less dedicated workers, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe more.
Depends.
I don't know. Yeah.
Depends on the person, I guess.
Uh-huh.
I think I got what I needed to get
Okay.
from you, so thank you very much for your help.
You're welcome. You had that all together?
Yep.